You have somehow ended up listening to The Stuff That's Real That You Didn't Know Was Real, But Also Is Cool podcast. Or Sturty Dickwur Bayik. Or, never mind.
Hey, you've tuned in, and we're going to give this a try. Stuff That's Real That You Didn't Know Was Real, But Also Is Cool podcast with me, Kevin Tomlinson, and more importantly, with my good friend Nick Thacker, who is usually the guy who announces and rolls us in. So I don't know if you got a script, man. I don't know if I just blew the whole intro, but here we are.
Clearly, based on previous episodes, you know that there is no script in sight for any of this.
There is no script. That's kind of the story of my life, man. I know there is no script. Maybe that's yet another autobiography title.
The Kevin Tomlinson story. There is no script.
Yeah, there is no script. The Kevin Tomlinson story. There is no script, but we do present two articles or two ideas that we've stumbled across that fits the moniker of the show, that by being both cool, unknown in a lot of cases, and I said both, but there's three little factors here. It's cool, it's real, and you may not have known about it.
There you go.
This thing's a mouthful no matter how I try to describe the show. But
so it's
I'm
just cool stuff. It's cool stuff, and maybe
cool
you knew
stuff.
about it, but we're gonna dive into it a little bit because, and this is kind of the key here, Mr. Tomlinson, we are both thriller authors, and we love ideas like this because we get to explore things that are, based on fact, but that can be extrapolated into things that may not be fact. And that's called fiction. And that's what we do all day, every day, 24/7, 365, however many days of the year there are.
Did you, when you're growing up, I don't know, you're younger than I am, but so there were those shows when I was growing up, like one of them was a show called That's Incredible. And then there was Ripley's Believe It or Not, shows like that, right? Where they would go and find like these weird, real things out in the world. And they'd kind of do interviews with people. Like one of the ones I remember from That's Incredible was a guy who was blinded when he was a kid, but could use echolocation while riding a bicycle.
Oh, that's cool.
So stuff like that, right? So that's like that. When you and I grew up, we decided we were going to write stories that were a lot like that stuff, quirky bits of history or whatever. I remember when I first started writing all the Kotler books, that was the rule. It was misplaced history was the way I advertised it. So I'll go first this time. So what I did, one of the things I've been trying to do is whenever I find one of these, I've been trying to find stuff that kind of link back to something I've written or research on something maybe I'm going to write. So this one in particular, so I released a book of about a year ago now, I think, called The Sleepers War. And the premise of the book was that there's this plant, this rare plant that was found in the Sonoma Desert with ties to Greek culture, and the Makir Ipra, I believe was the name of it. You'll have to check me on that. But the plant itself was being used as a way to induce sleep for people who would be traveling into space. So it was kind of a hot thing, and the bad guys were after it. And our archaeological hero, Dan Kotler, is enlisted to help because of the connection to ancient Greek, right? So in the book, I talked about several myths about sleepers. And the one we usually remember most is Rip Van Winkle, who fell asleep and woke up like 100 years later, and the world had changed. And so we tend to think of that, and that's Washington Irving's story. That's one of the first American sci-fi stories, in essence. But we tend to think of that story whenever we think about a sleeper who goes to sleep and wakes up in the future. But apparently he borrowed elements from that story from this story, which was the Seven Sleepers of Ephesus. And the idea here, and I'm looking at an article on Britannica.com, and I found tons of these things when I was doing my research. This is just one of hundreds and hundreds of myths about sleepers. Okay. And a lot of them get tied back to Christianity in particular, but also the Muslim faith, because there's the idea of resurrection of the dead.
Okay, sure.
So some of these stories get tied back as proof of the resurrection, or as a way to show people that resurrection wasn't a one-off kind of thing. So in this article, and I'll just read a quick bit of it. It says, 7 sleepers of Ephesus, heroes of a famous legend that, because it affirmed the resurrection of the dead, had a lasting popularity in all Christendom and in Islam during the Middle Ages. And according to the story, during the persecution of Christians in 250 CE, under the Roman Emperor Decius, 7, sometimes 8 in other versions, Christian soldiers were concealed near their native city of Ephesus in a cave to which the entry was later sealed. There, having protected themselves from being forced to do pagan sacrifices, they fell into a miraculous sleep. During the reign of the Eastern Roman Emperor Theodosius II, and that was 408 to 450 CE, the cave was reopened, the sleepers awoke, and the emperor was moved by their miraculous presence and by their witness to their Christian doctrine of the body's resurrection. Having explained the profound meaning of their experience, the 7 died, whereupon Theodosius ordered their remains to be richly enshrined, and he absolved all bishops who had been persecuted for believing in the resurrection. So it is a tale of 7 early Christians who basically slept for about 200 years, 150 to 200 years in a cave, which is very similar to the story Rip Van Winkle, but is also similar to a whole bunch of other myths that if you go digging, you will uncover. I was actually kind of fascinated by the number of times this theme comes up in history. You've got all kinds of stories of gods and goddesses and demigods and things that go to sleep and wake up, centuries later, years later, or centuries later. So there's something to that. I'm a big fan of what's termed in the archaeological circles as comparative mythology, which is something that if you're a follower of guys like Graham Hancock and basically anybody who was a guest star or guest interview on Ancient Aliens, comparative mythology is the idea that even disparate cultures that had nothing to do with each other often have similar sort of iconic things in their mythology.
A great example is the flood myth, right? I mean, we've got obviously the biblical biggest, flood. Yeah. We've got from even Greek to Egyptian to the early Syrian culture, things like that talk about a flood myth.
Even the Mesoamerican cultures.
The Mesoamericans and this South American called, Inca Maya, or the Aztec and Inca have the same sort of thing. And so what it comes down to, Kevin, is like, these disparate cultures probably each embellish the story their own way, but the story is based on factual history.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm reading this story as you're talking about it, and I'm like, this is crazy. So I wonder if there's something here, if maybe it wasn't these 7 people and maybe it wasn't 250 years, but something crazy happened. Is kind of how you can sum this up, right? And we don't know what that crazy thing was.
Yeah, we know that most mythologies have some sort of root in something historic and factual. The details can sometimes be a little skewed, but in general, it's not so uncommon. And if you think about it, the myth of the sleeper has permeated a lot of our culture for many, many centuries. I mean, think about Sleeping Beauty as one example. In more modern history, the story of Captain America. He actually crash lands in the Arctic and sleeps for 50 years. So, this idea of, one of my series, the Citadel series, it uses a technology that's become kind of a mainstay in sci-fi, which is the idea of capsules, cryogenic sleep capsules. So, this idea now has some scientific root. Like science is actually looking for ways, and that's the root of Sleeper's War, is that science is looking for ways to induce stasis, which means that all activity in the body stops so that the body can be transported. Basically, it's like being able to go to sleep on the airplane and wake up at your destination. But instead of being dehydrated and having to pee really badly, you would still have the taste of the Cheetos you ate just before you went under in your mouth. So that's the gist of that whole.
You and I have very different experiences when we fly, apparently.
I wake up with Cheeto dust and the smell of hand sanitizer in my nostrils.
So what do you think happened here? Was this, I mean, did these guys really walk into a cave and fall asleep and then wake up 250 years later? I mean, I know that's the myth, but what do you think actually is going on here?
I mean, it's hard to say because first of all, I mean, it is early years in the Christian faith. What I think is interesting is they went into the cave to escape persecution and being forced to do something that was against their faith. And then when they emerged from the cave, their very existence was used to prove that what they stood for was upright and correct. So I think it's interesting though that whoever told the story first, if there's no fact behind it, what made them come up with the idea that there was a 200-year gap between going in and coming out? Like,
right.
And so when was the story written? And you would presume it was probably written in and around, I mean, it was probably first told in and around 400 to 450 Common Era CE. So, that would be 400 years after the birth and death and resurrection of Christ, or any figure similar to Christ. So, I just can't say for sure.
So I've got a couple theories. Well, actually, I've got a theory that, so what I like to do in my books, and I know you're the same way with with anything that's not sci-fi or fantasy, and I don't write those sci-fi a little bit, but I do thrillers that are modern day science, bleeding edge science, right? So technology that's kind of almost here, that, ripped from the page of Popular Science magazine.
From now.
Exactly. Yeah. So it may not be stuff that, you turn the light switch on and you can teleport, but teleportation is something we're studying in quantum physics right now. So we extrapolate that into anyway, the point is, by the end of the book, the whole book, you've got this weird, unknown mystery going on, usually that the bad guy is using for nefarious purposes. Right. And then by the end of it, I try as hard as I can to tie it back to, here's how this could happen in the real world. And here's what here's what the gag is, right? Here's the joke. Yeah. Here's the punchline. Right. And so for this story, the Seven Sleepers of Ephesus, I hear the punchline as, what if, Kevin, you take these guys, this let's say seven. It's just like the We Three Kings in biblical Christmas history. We don't actually know there were three of them, right? But there were wise men that came from the east, right? Right. A certain number of them, and they gave the three gifts that they gave, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, were known. Right. So we say there was three of them. Anyway, let's say it wasn't seven, but some amount of people hid from was it the Romans in order to escape persecution. Right. Yeah. So they wouldn't have to do pagan sacrifices, which is probably a good reason to hide, because some of them might have been the sacrifice. We don't know if they fell into a miraculous sleep because they were inside a cave, and then that cave got sealed up, and then they popped out 250 years later. So imagine the punchline of this book could be, it turns out, because this story exists in so many different, like you said, cultures, Greek, Syriac, Coptic, Georgian, it even shows up in the Quran, right? So it's probably based on some fact. So anyway, I'm getting to the point here. I think the fact could be, this cave was actually a cave network, and there were multiple entrances. And so the one they went in was the only one that was known. They thought it was just one small cave, but it ended up getting sealed up. But no one knew there were people inside, right? The people who sealed it were like, hey, we're going to seal this cave. Is anyone in there? And they didn't hear anything. And so they sealed it up. But what happened was the people who originally walked in kept going and popped out in this miraculous lush valley. And that's where they lived for 250 years. Yeah. And they had the whole little village and everything, but they thought they were secluded and isolated, in this valley. And eventually some explorers from that new civilization walked through a different cave and popped out the other side. that some people thought was the same cave 250 years earlier. And so that's how you could get kind of a,
I had
some
a
people
similar
fell asleep,
idea.
right?
Now, in
Okay.
my book, I wanted it to be more literal, so I came up with a natural source of stasis, right? Which was that plant, the
plant,
Makir Hypno, which I think was Greek for hypno is the root of our word hypnosis.
Hypnosis,
So
yeah.
I'm sleeper. But I was thinking about it as you were talking. I thought, what would be cool, and you kind of went in this direction. Is what if this was a group of people who went into this cave, and we know that there are underground cities. We're starting to discover more and more of them. Entire civilizations.
There's one like Turkey, right? There's like huge multi-level underground. Yeah, that's crazy.
Exactly. So, what if it wasn't the original 7, but was instead these 7 priests or 7 leaders, and so every generation in this underground civilization, they chose 7 to bear those names and bear their crests,
right? That's
and that sort of thing, and train them in the legends. So basically, it was a form of cultural reincarnation. So that once that cave was opened up, they emerged and they proclaim themselves to be these characters, and the Romans have records, and they say, "Oh my God, they're real." And so that became the legend, and the legend became fact, and now we have, thousands of years of Christianity as
these
religion that
scurvy
relies on
immune
resurrection.
Humans walked into a cave.
So totally going to write this book now.
You need to answer the vitamin D question. They didn't suffer from scurvy because blank blank blank. They ate some flower that grew in the cave. Gave them the vitamin D.
I like your idea of, and I've written about in some of my other books about underground, sort of stealing from the Jules Verne's Journey to the Center of the Earth, where there was a whole ecosystem underground.
Yeah, exactly.
So maybe it's something along those lines, or maybe there were shafts of some in Sleeper's War. They do go underground in the Sonoma Desert, where this plant is growing in a cavern that has a water supply from an underground waterfall, but also has in the mountains of the region, there are these crystal deposits that basically bounce light around until it ends up inside the cavern. So there's light, there's water, and this plant just proliferates throughout the entire cavern. That was my solution. There were no people there. There were people who knew about it and visited there until their civilization ended, but the plant had grown unmolested for centuries.
Oh, I like that. Yeah,
cool. You should read the book.
I might have read that. I might have picked that one up. I'll link to the book too, by the way.
The idea there is history and the mythology are rife with stories of the sleeper, and they're very similar, usually very similar. Half the time, I'd say maybe even 3/4 of the time, the sleeper literally just goes to sleep there's no explanation as to why they wake up a century later. There was another story I read that was based that they think may have been more the root of this story about the 7 sleepers. They say was definitely something that Washington Irving had read and considered, but there was another story more recent about kids taking a nap under a tree, and when they got back to their little village that they lived in, they didn't no one recognized them, they didn't recognize anybody, everyone spoke a different language, and it was like Spanish settlers or something. So there's lots of stories like that. People love stories like that.
Yeah, I did one from my book Relics, where Myers wakes up and it's this post-apocalyptic hellscape, and he sees a sign that says Istanbul, and of course it's just this demolished city, and he doesn't remember anything. He walks in and somebody finally recognizes him and goes, "Dude, you're the president of the United States, but like 8 years ago." And he doesn't remember anything. So that's it's all kind of, I love that kind of stuff, that the time travel.
See, you just opened up a whole new vein there, because now you can lump in stories like Walking Dead, where Rick Grimes wakes up after the apocalypse, or 8 days later, or several of the movies and television shows where somebody was in a coma or something.
Right. Right.
So
comas
that could
comas
be a
are great
natural
for fiction
explanation.
authors because we can just so much can happen while someone's in a coma.
We use the hell of a coma. And because once the coma, and I think one of the reasons why that is a useful trope for especially thriller writers is that, because look, think about Jason Bourne, right?
Mm-hmm.
It gives us a chance to handle exposition in a way that feels natural, but is still just as ham-fisted as just doing a data dump on people.
Right, exactly. Absolutely. Oh, that's good stuff, man.
Well, what did you bring to the table?
I've cooked up something good that this one's probably less in the realm of stuff you didn't know about, but definitely 100% absolutely in the realm of stuff that's really cool. I'm going to tell a little story here, and Kevin's probably going to know right away where I'm going with it. But this story is actually the denouement scene or scenes of a previous story called the Manhattan Project. So we've got these guys who are all working together, these buddies, and they're at Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico, United States. And they have just come off the high horse of dropping their science project on Nagasaki and Hiroshima in the mid 40s, right? And so we all know that story. This is 1950. And they're still there at Los Alamos. They're still hanging out together. They're still eating lunch and stuff. And one day at lunch, one of them exclaims, all of a sudden, "Where are they?" Or according to another guy's remembrance of this conversation, "Don't you ever wonder where everybody is? Where is everybody?" And everybody laughed. And the reason everybody laughed was these guys were all working on studying anomalies like unidentified flying objects. They were studying space. They were studying the potentiality of extraterrestrial life. And the guy who asked the question, we all know as Fermi, Fermi, right?
Yeah.
Enrico Fermi. He's an Italian-American physicist, and he has a scientific, essentially mind game associated with his name called the Fermi paradox. And that's what I think is really cool and stuff that people may not know. But the whole idea of the Fermi paradox and the reason he asked this question, where is everybody? And everybody started laughing, was the paradox essentially is, hey, we know that there are billions of stars in the Milky Way. That's just our galaxy. Billions of stars, just like our sun, in our own galaxy. Now, without even getting into how many other galaxies there are, right? Trillions upon trillions. Just within our own galaxy, there's billions of stars, just like the sun. So with a very high probability, these physicists, who are smarter than me, I'll go ahead and admit, have said some of these stars are going to have Earth-like planets. And many of these stars, and hence the planets next to them, are much older than the sun. Now, I'm reading from Wikipedia's article on this, but this is a really good overview of the Fermi paradox. So if the Earth is typical in our galaxy, if there's a lot of Earths around, some of those Earths may have, and some would say should have, developed intelligent life long ago. So some of those civilizations may have developed interstellar travel, right? And we're talking, mathematically speaking, this is incomprehensible numbers. So the statistic probability of other Earth-like planets developing intelligent life is actually astronomical, like it should have happened.
Yeah. So
the Fermi paradox is, where are they? Where are the people? Where are all the other aliens? Where are all these civilizations that should exist? I've always loved this paradox. I think I read about it originally in like a Scientific American or something like that. But it's before, we as kids, we all watch movies and the aliens are cool, little green guys with big heads. But when you grow up a little bit and just a little bit about science and stuff, it starts to be a pretty mature question. Like, where is everybody? Like, realistically speaking, why are there no other, not even human-like, but just other mammalian-like or reptilian or anything that we've never heard anything.
Yeah.
So that's the gist of it. There's a couple postulations about where those people might be, and we can get into some of that. But just at that, you obviously know this paradox, Kevin, and it's something you've written about in your sci-fi stuff too. But I've always been fascinated by this one.
Yeah, and there's been fairly recently there are physicists taking pot shots at at the Fermi paradox and the equation itself, and there's sort of an updated equation. And I kind of feel like that's a little bit of a cop out, but science, we got to keep moving forward.
Sure.
But the updated equations are like, well, the chances are a lot less than we thought, So, and I'm always fascinated when that sort of thing happens, because it's like, well, we decided to change the formula, and now it's things aren't as exciting as you thought they were. Like, well, in what way did you change the formula? But whatever, that's the way that stuff
are
works.
there fewer stars now, or are there, you just like calling Earth like,
I think it's
is
more
is the goalpost moving, right?
Yeah, it's more that they've changed some of the criteria for what would improve the odds of life on a planet,
Right.
But I'll tell you the thing that has been kind of nagging at me, and this is an old theory as well, but it's getting new life now, and that is the holographic theory. And it's the idea, it's sort of, if you've seen the film series The Matrix, then you're on the right track. It's the idea that we're living in a simulation. And there's a whole lot that kind of tags along with this, that there's theoretically a limit to what we could actually accomplish within the simulation. For example, could we, if we are living in a simulated universe, would we be able to create a simulation so advanced that we could create, billions and billions of other simulated realities? And for a long while, they thought that no, you would run out of processing power, because that's just the way computers work. Now, though, since we've been tinkering with ideas like quantum computing, where instead of a 2-bit process or a 30-bit sort of program or 64-bit program, instead of 2 bits on and off, in quantum computing, it's like 18 bits on or off. And so your permutations become in the multiple trillions or quadrillions. I mean, as far as, that's why something encrypted with a quantum computer could potentially be unencryptable without that same quantum computer. Like, there's theories like that. So I know it sounds like I've gone far afield here, but what that means is, if we are living in a simulated reality, then the Fermi paradox may have completely underestimated the number of realities or number of worlds there could be, but it's looking in the wrong place. So
this gets into the parallel universe kind of theories as well.
The whole multi-worlds theory, and so
which sounds Family Guy did a great thing about the multiverse, and it's so humorous and hilarious, but it's also so scientifically plausible. And again, I'm not a scientist at all, but I love this stuff. I'm the guy who, after watching Interstellar, bought Kip Thorne's, he's the physicist they consulted for that movie, who's a very real physicist and very smart guy, who wrote an entire book. It's like a coffee table kind of thing, because it's beautiful pictures and renderings and all that. But he explained all the science in there and dumbed it down enough for a guy like me to understand. So I'm the nerd who's like, well, I didn't go to school to be a physicist, but I know a little bit about physics. And this kind of stuff gets just, in my opinion, infinitely more plausible the more science and mathematics we throw at it.
Yeah, right.
Meaning plausible being that there's other life out there somewhere. That's the plausible. That's what I'm talking about.
Right.
Yeah.
That's what I believe as well. And that the whole point of science is to create more questions than answers. Honestly, I mean, we're always pursuing the answers, but science is all about creating more questions.
Science is the whole idea of it is we want to know the answer, and so in order to find the answer, we're going to try to disprove our working theory, our working hypothesis.
Right. Exactly.
And that's what science is. That's the scientific method, is to try to disprove what we think is proven.
Right. So I've always been fascinated by the Fermi paradox. I've always been fascinated by that question. If you ever watched the film Contact,
Carl Sagan's book,
Matthew McConaughey's line in there, to me, always it was Carl Sagan's line first, but the McConaughey's line in that film was, if there's no life out there, it's an incredible waste of space. Or maybe that was Sissy Spacek or somebody else's line. Who was,
too long,
wait,
man.
who was in that? I don't remember.
Like,
I don't even remember who was in the
like
movie. All I know is Matthew McConaughey was in the movie. And I thought that was his line. It was definitely Carl Sagan's line in the book. The incredible waste of space made the most sense to me out of every theory of reality that I'd ever heard. Because why would there, set aside your belief in a deity, set aside your belief in anything that could influence the creation of the universe. If even the universe just evolved on its own, we can look at evolutionary systems down to the microscopic level, the subatomic level, and we never ever see such a phenomenal waste of efficiency, energy in space, ever.
Right.
So if we've always kind of considered that the universe itself is a macrocosm of the subatomic world, microscopic world. I think that bears out. So there's no reason to believe that we are living as an isolated incident.
And I take it to mean
vast
like
reality.
The laws of thermodynamics, if they're true, in at least classical physics, that entropy, which is this idea that everything kind of slides into chaos, it's actually everything kind of slides toward the least amount of resistance. Meaning, if there's order, it's because that's actually the cheapest and most efficient method of putting these things together, right? And so if we look at humanity and civilization and just really any life as potentially, now this takes kind of God out of the equation, and I'm not actually doing that because I think that there is a space for God, but that's not what this podcast is about. But anyway, just taking that momentarily out of the equation, if we agree that, this entropic method, that humans are the least, or the most efficient method for the universe to kind of coalesce, then why wouldn't that same coalescence happen on another Earth-like planet? And so that's kind of where I'm going. It's like, well, if this also naturally happened, then it would take
the same argument for the idea of the humanoid figure as being a default template for
exactly.
So we really, honestly, we have no way to know if there is intelligent life beyond Earth. The likelihood is that it looks, acts, thinks, and behaves nothing like us at all. So it's sort of the height of arrogance to assume that a man-shaped figure is going to step off of a saucer and greet us with his three-fingered hand.
It makes good TV, but exactly, it may look more like an Oort cloud,
Yeah, I remember watching. There was those TV series on, I think, History Channel or Discovery Science, maybe one of those networks, and it was Life After Humanity or something. I think was the name of it. Life After Humans. And what it did was a progression of like what would happen if basically the premise was human beings just flat out disappeared. We just vanished one instant. So the Great Rapture or something, but we were there 1 second, we were gone the next. So what happens to the world without us in it? So there was a whole cascade of horrible things that happened, like nuclear meltdowns and stuff like that. But then, they kept going like, here's 100,000 years in the future and 200,000 and a million years. One of the things that they posited was that the most likely species on the planet to evolve into a sentient life form was the octopus.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's got to be the octopus.
Yeah, and they actually had them. Now, if you think about it, because of the octopus, now one of the things that aided human beings in becoming intelligent was the size of our cranium, which is why we are born basically premature by nature. Like we're born and have to be cared for, whereas every other animal in nature is born and is essentially ready to start walking and fending for itself to some degree. We are in a larval state for the first year or so of our lives, but the octopus
sometimes has like 18 years or more.
Sometimes more. I mean, I'm 48, so. The octopus, though, has an evolutionary advantage over a lot of other creatures in that its cranium is completely fluid. Like it can get as big as it needs to. Now that means also it's because it doesn't have a skeleton, right? So it's essentially a pneumatically based creature.
It's a balloon.
Yeah. So the theory would be they would eventually. Without humanity on land and other mammals on land to be a natural predator for it, it would eventually venture onto land it could probably manage to survive for long periods by taking in oxygen from the water and essentially holding it in its own
a sponge,
self-contained scuba gear, and then eventually it would become, because it's got 8 arms, it could grab onto things, swing from tree limbs, etc. It would become basically what our hands became, its entire body could become. And so over time it would evolve into a fully intelligent species with its own mathematics, science, and history, and the world would look incredibly different than the way it looks now. When I saw that, it was like turning on a light in my brain. Like, there's literally no reason why, if that's what science thinks could happen here after humanity goes away, there's no reason why something like that doesn't exist already out in the universe or the multiverse somewhere.
Right.
So yeah. Anyway, we kind of meandered, and it's my fault. But
no, it's good. It's good stuff.
Where is everybody? Is a very valid question. Like, where the hell is everybody?
I'll drop some links here, of course, in the show notes. So if you're listening, you want to read more from actual scientists. There's a lot of great stuff out there. But I love the Fermi paradox, not only for its question, but also because it's a pretty simple question. Like, anyone can understand that question, and some of the answers to the question are what you should read. Don't have time to get into all of them, but there's things like the Great Filter, that's just absolutely fascinating. And one of my favorite kind of answer, if you will, to this, and I don't remember where I read this, but it was the idea that we just don't have the technology or equipment to hear any of it. Maybe there's all these. So basically, thinking the analogy that was given that I love was, imagine walking into a busy lobby of a New York City skyscraper where there's people everywhere checking cell phones, computers, and phones ringing and all that stuff. There's all kinds of radio frequencies going around. And then you turn on a walkie-talkie set to one frequency, and you're talking to one person on the other end that says, "Hey, do you have any sign of life? Is there anything on the radio?"
Yeah.
And then you say, "Nope, nothing at all. There's no one here."
If your perception were only based on signals, and the only signal you were capable of interpreting was the one going between those two walkie-talkies, you would miss all the cell phones,
you'd miss
all
everything
the smart
else.
Tablets, all
the completely different, and that's just in one. That's just in the whole bandwidth of frequencies. I mean, there's all kinds of. What about light? The light wave, frequency. And anyway, there's all kinds of crazy stuff that. I just love that analogy because it really made sense to me. It was like, oh yeah, maybe there's all kinds of stuff buzzing around that we don't even know. Like, what are those little things that fly through the earth? The little tiny particles. What are they called?
Like muons, or you're talking about like quarks?
Quarks, maybe. No, that's not quarks. I can't remember it.
Yeah.
I'll have to cut that out. I'll have to figure it out.
We'll have to cut our ignorance out of the podcast.
We don't want to sound dumb. No, there's something I can't remember what it was. I mean, I don't know, maybe something simple as a photon, but like something that we didn't know we could measure until we accidentally started measuring it, essentially, right? And then now we're like, this shit's all around us. It's everywhere. We can't
it's
get away
interesting.
from it. I'm
reading a book right now called The Intention Experiment, and it is a sort of scientific look at the potential for things like, there's actually a lot of research into fields like ESP, remote healing, things like that. And the author of this book wanted to explore the actual science behind all this stuff and see like who's discovered what. And there are studies. There's tons and tons of studies. This is a real thing that basically every living thing emits and receives light. And it's not light we can perceive with our naked eye most of the time, but it is there, and it hints at a continual field of connection between all living things. So the Force, if you're a Star Wars fan. But you start thinking about that, and sometimes those signals can be disrupted by things like cosmic rays, and there's all these studies that show if you were to put someone in a room that was built like a Faraday cage where it blocked out electromagnetic or electrical impulses, you can do certain tests and measure and see, an increase here and a decrease there.
Still midi-chlorians.
There's still midi-chlorians, and you're still the chosen. But that shows you immediately, like there's just something we're only on the cusp of even knowing exists.
Right.
So in terms of communication, we could be currently bombarded by communication from a billion different cultures and civilizations, but we haven't developed ears to hear,
Right.
as you
Exactly.
as you would phrase biblically.
They're
We
all
don't
saying,
have
"Hey,
ears to
get
hear,
out of the
eyes to
way.
see.
The bad
Yeah.
guys are coming. Get out of the way.
Yeah.
What are you doing?
They're like,
move your
yeah.
planet."
Hey, stop irradiating yourselves. We'd like to come visit, you know?
Exactly.
Turn off all the EMF. Anyway, great topic, man. I could spend that
seriously
for hours.
It's a good one. Same, and I have spent hours on it. You know, I've forgotten more about it than I remember, but it is the Fermi paradox is absolutely fascinating to me. So, you know, we'll try to touch on stuff like this. I like the scientific stuff a lot, even though I don't know enough about it, because it's cool, it's real, and there's just more that we don't know than we do.
I have an engineering background, and so this stuff has always been kind of part of my mental landscape.
Well, just because you drove trains, man, doesn't mean that you can make it seem like you're a...
Yeah. I mean, I say that because I want everyone to ooh and ah over my credentials, but the truth is, even if you studied and specialized in a field, it's kind of rare for you to, I mean, you're just never going to know all of it, and you're never going to understand all of it.
Right.
But it's
our goal on this show is to get you, listener, as close as possible to knowing all of it. So that's our task here.
So congratulations, everyone. You are one podcast closer to knowing it all.
It's a tall order, but that's what we're here. We're here to serve. We're here to serve. We're here for your success.
So do we want to go ahead and we need to go ahead and wrap up, I guess.
Let's wrap up. Yeah.
So we're going to go ahead and wrap up. And if you were interested in today's topics, and you know you were, why don't you slip over to stuffthat'sreal.com. That's where we're hosting. That's the home of the podcast. But you're also going to be able to, you'll catch up on back episodes. You'll find links to me and Nick and the stuff that we do. But you'll also be able to send us a note and tell us the kind of stuff that's real that you want to hear more about, so that we can maybe cover that in a future episode. We're always looking for sources, and we are lazy as hell. So send us links to articles, videos, and anything else you can think of. Nick, you want to throw anything in there before we shut her down?
Good, man. If you've got something that is real that we didn't know was real, but also is cool, look at that. I got it all. Then head on over to stuffthat'sreal.com and find us there.
We're gonna have a bumper sticker, but you need a big ass bumper. All right, everybody. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you all.
See you next week.
Stuff That's Real.